"You worthless parasite." That's what my mother-in-law just screamed at me in front of the entire family. Eleanor stood there like a queen pronouncing judgment, her voice dripping with 3 years of accumulated hatred. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to echo her cruel words. My husband Michael just sat there, unable to meet my eyes, while his family watched this public execution. I felt my heart shatter into a million pieces as I rose from my chair, my legs barely able to support me. Eleanor's satisfied smile told me she had been planning this moment, waiting for the perfect audience to destroy me completely. Through my tears, I managed to whisper the only words I could find. "One day, Eleanor, you're going to eat those words." As I reached the door, something inside me shifted. The pain was still there, but so was something else. Something stronger. Behind me, I heard Eleanor's voice. "Good riddance. Maybe now we can have a civilized dinner without the hired help." That was the moment I knew everything was about to change. Eleanor had no idea what was coming for her. As I walked away from that dining room, I made a promise to myself that would change all of our lives forever. Eleanor thought she had won the war. She had no idea the battle was just beginning. Sitting in my car outside their mansion, I wiped away my tears and made the decision that would turn Eleanor's world upside down. The woman who would return to face Eleanor would not be the same broken person who left that dining room. Eleanor raised her glass in celebration, completely unaware that her moment of triumph would soon become her greatest humiliation. Because sometimes the universe has a way of making people pay for their cruelty in the most unexpected ways. And Eleanor Wellington was about to learn that lesson in a way she would never, ever forget. She thought calling me worthless would be the end of our story. She couldn't have been more wrong. What happened next would prove that sometimes the people you underestimate the most are the ones who surprise you the greatest. This is the story of how Eleanor's cruelest moment became the beginning of her biggest nightmare and my sweetest victory. Where are you watching from today? Let me know in the comments below. If you want to see how this story unfolds, hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible true stories. 2 years ago, I thought I was living a fairy tale when I married Michael Wellington. The church was filled with white roses, and I felt like the luckiest woman alive walking down that aisle toward the man I loved with all my heart. Everything seemed perfect. The music, the flowers, the way Michael's eyes lit up when he saw me in my dress. But even then, I could feel Eleanor's cold disapproval burning into my back as I approached the altar. Eleanor made her feelings crystal clear from the very beginning. She sat in the front row with her arms crossed, looking like she was attending a funeral instead of her son's wedding. During the ceremony, she kept shaking her head and whispering to relatives about how this marriage was a terrible mistake. I tried to focus on Michael's loving gaze, but Eleanor's presence cast a shadow over what should have been the happiest day of my life. At the reception, Eleanor wasted no time questioning my intentions to anyone who would listen. She told family friends that she didn't understand why I was in such a hurry to marry her son, suggesting there must be some hidden agenda. She made comments about how I came from nothing and how convenient it was that I found love with someone from their wealthy family. Her words were carefully chosen to plant seeds of doubt about my character and motives. When Michael overheard some of these conversations, he tried to defend me, but his efforts were half-hearted at best. He would say things like, "Mother, please give Sarah a chance," or "I really love her, and I hope you'll learn to love her too." But I could see he was more concerned about keeping peace than standing up strongly for his new wife. His timid responses only seemed to encourage Eleanor's belief that she could influence him against me. After our honeymoon, I threw myself into my work as a nurse at Boston General Hospital. I was determined to prove that I wasn't the gold digger Eleanor painted me to be. I worked double shifts, stayed late to help patients, and took on extra responsibilities whenever possible. My colleagues respected my dedication, and I found purpose in caring for people during their most vulnerable moments. But no matter how hard I worked, it was never enough to change Eleanor's opinion of me. There were nights I came home so exhausted I could barely stand, but I knew that every hour I worked was proof of my character. I wasn't some lazy woman looking for an easy life. I was building a career and contributing to society. I saved every penny I could, hoping to show the Wellington family that I was financially responsible and independent. Little did I know that Eleanor was already spreading lies about my work ethic to anyone who would listen. While I was working myself to exhaustion, Eleanor was busy hosting lunch meetings with her social circle, spreading the narrative that I was a lazy opportunist. She told her wealthy friends that I had deliberately targeted Michael for his money and that I was probably just pretending to work hard to maintain my cover. She painted me as a master manipulator who had somehow tricked her intelligent son into marriage, warning other mothers to watch out for women like me. Meanwhile, Michael and I were living in a modest apartment while saving money for our future. I insisted we live within our means rather than accepting handouts from his family, but Eleanor twisted this into evidence that I was bleeding him dry financially. She claimed I was forcing her son to live below his station and that it was embarrassing for the Wellington name. Every choice I made to be independent and responsible was somehow turned into proof of my supposed greed and manipulation. Eleanor's campaign against me became a full-time hobby. She would call family members and friends regularly, updating them on my latest offenses and gathering support for her belief that I was wrong for Michael. She complained that I wasn't social enough, that I worked too much, that I wasn't grateful enough for being welcomed into their family. No matter what I did, she found a way to criticize it and use it as evidence that I was unsuitable for her precious son. The constant pressure from his mother began taking a toll on Michael. He started coming home from family visits looking stressed and confused, sometimes questioning whether we were moving too fast or if maybe we should have waited longer before getting married. He never directly accused me of being a gold digger, but I could see the doubt creeping in. Eleanor's poison was working, slowly but surely driving a wedge between us, and I felt powerless to stop it while maintaining my dignity and integrity. Every morning at 6 a.m., I would arrive at Boston General Hospital and throw myself into caring for my patients. Being a nurse wasn't just a job for me, it was my calling. I found meaning in holding the hand of a scared patient before surgery or staying late to comfort a family receiving difficult news. My supervisors consistently praised my work ethic and compassion, but none of that mattered to Eleanor, who saw my career as nothing more than a convenient cover story for my supposed gold-digging schemes. There were countless nights I worked double shifts, covering for sick colleagues or staying to help during medical emergencies. I would drag myself to the parking lot at midnight, my feet aching and my scrub stained, knowing I had to be back in 6 hours. But I never complained because I genuinely loved what I did, and I was determined to prove that I wasn't the lazy opportunist Eleanor made me out to be. Every extra hour I worked was a silent protest against her accusations. Michael and I lived in a tiny one-bedroom apartment across town, far from the Wellington family mansion. I insisted we pay our own rent and buy our own groceries, refusing any financial help from his family. I cooked simple meals on our secondhand stove and shopped at discount stores, determined to build our life together based on our own hard work and love. But Eleanor twisted this independence into evidence that I was somehow taking advantage of her son financially. Every family gathering became an opportunity for Eleanor to make cutting remarks about my choices. She would comment on my cheap clothes, my unfashionable hairstyle, or how tired I always looked. When I explained that I worked long hours at the hospital, she would respond with something like, "How convenient that you're always too busy working to spend quality time with your husband." She made it sound like my dedication to my patients was actually neglect of my marriage duties. Michael would occasionally speak up in my defense, but his efforts were always weak and apologetic. He might say something like, "Mother, Sarah works very hard," or "Please don't criticize her appearance," but he never stood up to Eleanor with real conviction. I could see he was torn between loyalty to his mother and love for his wife, but his inability to firmly defend me only encouraged Eleanor to continue her attacks. Sometimes I wondered if he secretly agreed with some of her criticisms. On top of my demanding hospital schedule, I took care of all the household responsibilities. I cleaned our apartment, did the laundry, grocery shopping, and cooking, all while working full-time as a nurse. I wanted to be the perfect wife and prove that I could handle everything without complaint. But Eleanor somehow found fault even in this, suggesting that I was playing house and that my domestic efforts were just another act to keep Michael happy and secured. Eleanor made sure that every member of the Wellington family knew her opinion of me. She would call Michael's aunts, uncles, and cousins regularly to share her concerns about our marriage. She painted me as a master manipulator who had somehow fooled her son into believing I was a good woman. She told them to watch for signs that I was taking advantage of Michael financially or emotionally, turning family gatherings into opportunities for them to scrutinize my every word and action. Family events became increasingly uncomfortable as Eleanor's poison spread through the Wellington clan. I would sit quietly at dinner parties while relatives whispered and shot glances in my direction. Conversations would stop when I approached, and I could feel the weight of their judgment in every interaction. They had been told I was a threat to their family, and they treated me like an outsider who didn't belong in their privileged world, no matter how kind or respectful I tried to be. The worst part was overhearing Eleanor's comments when she thought I wasn't listening. She would tell people that I was beneath the Wellington standards, that Michael could have done so much better, and that she was just waiting for me to show my true colors. She spoke about me like I was a temporary inconvenience that would eventually be removed from their lives. Each cruel word felt like a knife to my heart, especially because no one ever defended me or told her stop. Many nights, I would lie awake next to Michael, feeling completely alone despite being married to the man I loved. The constant criticism and judgment from his family was wearing me down, making me question my own worth and whether I was really good enough for him. I felt like I was fighting a war that I could never win, no matter how hard I worked or how perfectly I tried to behave. Eleanor had made it clear that nothing I did would ever be enough to earn her acceptance or respect. It was a Tuesday afternoon when everything changed forever. I had just finished a grueling 12-hour shift at the hospital and was looking forward to a quiet evening at home when I found a thick, cream-colored envelope wedged between our apartment door and the frame. The paper felt expensive between my fingers, heavier than anything I had ever received in the mail, and the return address showed Harrison and Associates legal firm in elegant embossed lettering that seemed to shimmer in the hallway light. My heart immediately started racing with worry. Were we being sued? Had something happened to Michael? I couldn't imagine why a prestigious law firm would be contacting someone like me, a simple nurse living paycheck to paycheck in a tiny apartment. With trembling hands, I sat down at our tiny kitchen table and carefully opened the envelope, trying not to damage what was clearly expensive stationery. Inside was a formal letter on thick letterhead requesting my presence at their downtown office for a matter of significant importance regarding your inheritance. I read those words 3 times before they began to sink in, each reading making less sense than the last. Inheritance? That was completely impossible. My parents had died when I was young in a car accident, leaving me with nothing but debt and funeral expenses. I had been raised by my aunt who worked 2 jobs just to keep us afloat, and we had always struggled financially. There had never been any family money, wealthy relatives, or even family heirlooms in my background. I stared at the letter in complete bewilderment, wondering if this was some kind of elaborate mistake or perhaps even a scam targeting vulnerable people. Maybe they had the wrong Sarah Miller. Surely there were dozens of women with my name in Boston. I checked the envelope again, but there was my full name and current address written in perfect calligraphy. The letter mentioned specific details about my birth date and my parents' names that would be impossible for scammers to know. My hands were shaking as I reread every word, trying to find some explanation for this impossible situation. Could there really be some distant relative I had never known about? Was it possible that my aunt had kept family secrets from me all these years? The next day, I took time off work and nervously made my way to the impressive glass building that housed Harrison and Associates. The law office was more luxurious than anything I had ever seen, with marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and original oil paintings adorning the walls. When I gave my name to the receptionist, I was immediately escorted to a corner office where a distinguished gentleman in his 50s stood to greet me. Miss Miller, or should I say Mrs. Wellington now? I'm Robert Harrison, he said with a warm smile that somehow didn't ease my nervousness. "Please have a seat. What I'm about to tell you is going to change your life in ways you never imagined possible." I perched on the edge of the expensive leather chair, my hands clasped tightly in my lap as Mr. Harrison opened a thick file folder on his desk. "Mrs. Wellington, you are the sole heir to the estate of Grace Elizabeth Wellington, who passed away 3 months ago at the age of 87. The name hit me like a physical blow. Grace Wellington. That was Michael's family name, but I had never heard of any Grace in their family tree. Mr. Harrison continued speaking, but his words seemed to be coming from far away as my mind struggled to process this information. How could I be inheriting from someone with my husband's last name? Was this some kind of cruel joke that Eleanor had orchestrated to torment me? "I can see you're confused, and rightfully so," Mr. Harrison said gently, pulling out an old black and white photograph from the file. "Grace Wellington was your biological grandmother, Mrs. Wellington. She spent the last 30 years of her life searching for you." He slid the photograph across the desk, and I found myself staring at a woman who looked remarkably like my mother. The same delicate features, the same warm eyes, even the same way of holding her head slightly tilted when she smiled. My breath caught in my throat as I realized I was looking at family I never knew existed. "But how is that possible?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "My mother never mentioned anyone named Grace, and she certainly never said anything about being a Wellington." Mr. Harrison leaned back in his chair and began to explain the story that would completely change everything I thought I knew about my family. "Your mother, Rebecca, was Grace's only daughter. When Rebecca was 17, she fell in love with a young man that Grace's husband disapproved of, your father, James Miller. The family was torn apart by this relationship, and harsh words were spoken on both sides. When Rebecca became pregnant with you, she made the difficult decision to elope with your father and cut all ties with the Wellington family. Grace spent years trying to find her daughter, but Rebecca had changed her name and moved away, determined to build a new life without her family's wealth or approval. After your parents died in that car accident when you were 8, Grace hired private investigators to locate you, but you had gone to live with your aunt on your father's side, and she had moved you across the country. It took Grace nearly 20 years to finally track you down, and by then you'd already married into what she discovered was a distant branch of the same Wellington family tree. She was overjoyed to learn that fate had somehow brought you back to the Wellington name, even if through a different lineage. Grace passed away just 3 months after finding you, but she had already updated her will to leave everything to her only living descendant, you. Mr. Harrison slid several official documents across the desk, and I nearly fainted when I saw the numbers written there. $15 million in cash and investments, plus 3 properties, including a mansion in Beacon Hill, a summer home in Martha's Vineyard, and a substantial portfolio of stocks and bonds. There was also a charitable foundation that Grace had established, which would now be under my control. I stared at the papers in complete disbelief, unable to comprehend that I was looking at more money than I could spend in several lifetimes. "This can't be real," I whispered, my voice shaking. "People like me don't inherit $15 million. There has to be some mistake. I understand this is overwhelming, Mrs. Wellington, but I assure you this is completely legitimate," Mr. Harrison said kindly, offering me a box of tissues as tears streamed down my face. "Grace left you a personal letter as well, which might help explain her motivations and feelings." He handed me an envelope with my name written in elegant script. I could feel my grandmother's love even through the paper. She wanted you to know that she never stopped thinking about you and your mother, and that she deeply regretted the family discord that kept you apart. This inheritance is her way of making sure you have the security and opportunities that she was unable to provide during your childhood. I sat there in stunned silence, holding my grandmother's final words and trying to absorb the fact that my entire life had just changed forever. With trembling fingers, I carefully opened the envelope containing my grandmother's final letter to me. The paper was cream-colored and elegant, just like everything else Grace had touched, and her handwriting was beautiful and flowing despite her advanced age. "My dear Sarah," it began, "if you are reading this, Then I have passed away before having the chance to meet you in person, which breaks my heart more than you can imagine. I have spent the last 27 years searching for you, my precious granddaughter, ever since your dear mother and father were taken from us so tragically. Not a day has passed that I haven't thought about you and wondered what kind of woman you were becoming, whether you were happy, healthy, and loved. As I continued reading, Grace's words painted a picture of a woman consumed with regret and love. She explained how the argument with my mother had been the biggest mistake of her life, how her late husband's stubbornness had cost them their only daughter, and how she had spent decades trying to make amends for that terrible pride that had torn their family apart. I know that $15 million cannot replace the years we lost together, or give you back the childhood struggles you endure because of our family's foolish pride, she wrote. But I hope this inheritance can provide you with security, freedom, and the ability to help others the way I always try to do through my charitable work. You are a nurse, my dear, which tells me you have inherited our family's compassion and desire to care for others. Mr. Harrison allowed me several minutes to compose myself before explaining the practical details of my inheritance. Grace had been not just wealthy, but one of Boston's most respected philanthropists. She had donated millions to hospitals, orphanages, and educational institutions throughout her lifetime, but she had always kept a low profile about her charitable giving. Your grandmother was passionate about helping people who had been dealt difficult circumstances in life, particularly children who had lost their parents, as she knew all too well the pain of family separation, he explained. The irony wasn't lost on me that I had unknowingly been working in the very field that my grandmother had supported through her charitable foundation for decades. The scope of Grace's wealth was almost impossible to comprehend. Beyond the $15 million in liquid assets, there were 3 magnificent properties that I now owned outright. The Beacon Hill Mansion alone was worth several million dollars and had been featured in architectural magazines for its historical significance and stunning renovation. The Martha's Vineyard summer home sat on 5 acres of pristine waterfront property, and there was also a modest cabin in the mountains of Vermont that Grace had used as a retreat for writing and reflection. She loved that little cabin, Mr. Harrison said with a smile. She always said it reminded her that happiness didn't come from grand gestures, but from simple moments of peace and connection with nature. As Mr. Harrison showed me photographs of the properties and documentation of Grace's charitable activities, I began to understand that I wasn't just inheriting money. I was inheriting a legacy of service and compassion. Grace had established scholarship funds for nursing students, built housing for families of hospitalized children, and funded medical research into childhood diseases. She always said that wealth was meaningless unless it was used to make the world better for others, he explained. She hoped that whoever inherited her fortune would continue that tradition of giving back to the community. I realized that my grandmother and I shared the same values about helping others, even though we had never met. It was as if fate had guided me toward nursing and caring for people, preparing me to carry on her mission. The weight of this inheritance was overwhelming in ways that had nothing to do with the money itself. I was suddenly the trustee of a charitable foundation that supported causes I deeply believed in, the owner of properties that could house dozens of families, and a steward of investments that could fund medical research and education for generations. Mr. Harrison, I said quietly, I need time to process all of this. This inheritance comes with such enormous responsibility. How do I know I'm worthy of carrying on Grace's legacy? He smiled kindly and replied, Mrs. Wellington, the fact that you're asking that question tells me you're exactly the right person for this responsibility. Grace spent months researching your character and your work as a nurse before finalizing her will. She knew she was leaving her life's work in capable and caring hands. I walked to the large window overlooking downtown Boston and tried to absorb the magnitude of what had just happened to my life. This morning I had been Sarah Wellington, the struggling nurse that Eleanor constantly criticized and belittled. Now I was Sarah Wellington, heir to one of Boston's most significant charitable legacies and holder of wealth that exceeded the entire Wellington family fortune that Eleanor was so proud of. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. The woman who had spent 3 years calling me worthless and inferior had no idea that I was now worth more than her entire social circle combined. But more importantly, I was the granddaughter of Grace Wellington, a woman who had earned respect through kindness and generosity rather than through cruelty and judgment. Mr. Harrison, I have one very important question, I said, returning to my seat. Does anyone else know about this inheritance? Specifically, does anyone in the Wellington family know that Grace has passed away or that she left everything to me? He shook his head firmly. Grace was very specific about maintaining complete confidentiality until you decided how you wanted to handle the information. She suspected that if certain family members knew about her wealth and your connection to her, it might complicate your relationships in ways that wouldn't be healthy for anyone involved. The choice of when and how to reveal this inheritance is entirely yours to make. That was when I realized I had been given something even more valuable than money. I had been given the power to see people's true characters before they knew about my changed circumstances. A plan began forming in my mind as I sat there in that luxurious office, surrounded by documents that proved I was now one of the wealthiest women in Boston. For 3 years, Eleanor had treated me like dirt under her shoe, constantly reminding me that I wasn't good enough for her family standards. She had made assumptions about my worth based on my modest apartment, my secondhand clothes, and my working-class background. Now I had the opportunity to see exactly how she and the rest of the Wellington family would treat me when they discovered the truth about my financial status. Would their attitudes change instantly when they learned about my wealth? Would Eleanor suddenly try to become the loving mother-in-law she had never been? I realized this inheritance gave me the chance to conduct the ultimate test of character, not just for Eleanor, but for everyone who had judged me based on my perceived social and economic status. Mr. Harrison, I want to keep this inheritance completely confidential for now, I said with newfound confidence. I need time to decide how to handle this information, and I want to see how certain people continue to treat me before they know about my changed circumstances. He nodded approvingly and assured me that his firm would maintain absolute discretion. As I shook his hand and prepared to leave his office, I felt like I was walking into a completely new chapter of my life. The scared, insecure woman who had been crushed by Eleanor's cruelty just hours ago was gone forever. In her place was someone with the financial security and family legacy to stand up to anyone who tried to diminish her worth. Eleanor Wellington had no idea that the woman she had been tormenting was about to become the most powerful player in their family social circle. I sat in my car outside the law office for nearly an hour, staring at the legal documents that had just transformed my entire existence. The inheritance papers felt surreal in my hands, like props from someone else's life that had accidentally been placed in mine. $15 million. The number kept echoing in my mind, but it felt abstract and impossible. I had never even had $1,500 in my bank account at one time, and now I was supposedly worth more than most people could earn in several lifetimes. But beyond the money, what struck me most was learning about Grace, my grandmother who had spent decades searching for me, who had died just months before we could meet. The grief for a relationship that would never be was almost as overwhelming as the shock of sudden wealth. As I drove through the familiar streets of Boston, everything looked different somehow. The modest apartment buildings where I had always felt at home now seemed like reminders of a life I was leaving behind. The expensive shops and restaurants that I had always walked past without entering were now places I could afford to visit anytime I wanted. But the strangest part was realizing that I didn't want to change my lifestyle immediately. The inheritance felt like a test, not just of other people's characters, but of my own. Would knowing I was wealthy change who I was fundamentally? Would I become the kind of person who looked down on others the way Eleanor had looked down on me? I made a conscious decision to keep living exactly as I had been, at least for now, while I figured out how to handle this incredible responsibility. When I walked into our tiny apartment that evening, I saw it through completely new eyes. The secondhand furniture that I had been proud to afford on my nurse's salary, the small kitchen where I had cooked countless simple meals, the cramped bedroom where Michael and I had dreamed about our future together. All of it looked different now that I knew I could afford to live anywhere I wanted. But rather than feeling dissatisfied with our humble home, I felt a deep appreciation for the life we had built together with our own hands and hard work. This apartment represented our love story, our struggles, and our determination to make it on our own. No amount of inherited wealth could replace the pride I felt in what we had accomplished together, even if Eleanor had never recognized or respected our efforts. The hardest part was deciding whether to tell Michael immediately or wait to see how our relationship dynamics played out. I loved my husband deeply, but I couldn't ignore the fact that he had often failed to defend me against his mother's attacks. Was his loyalty to Eleanor stronger than his love for me? Would he suddenly become more protective and supportive if he knew I was wealthy? Or would he remain the same conflicted man torn between his wife and mother? I realized that keeping this secret for a while would give me the chance to see Michael's true character when he thought I was still the poor nurse his mother despised. If he could finally find the courage to stand up to Eleanor while believing I had nothing to offer but love, then I would know our marriage was built on a solid foundation. When Michael came home from work that evening, he found me in the kitchen preparing dinner just as I had done countless times before. He kissed my cheek and asked about my day, and I simply told him I'd taken some time off to run errands. It felt strange to keep such enormous news from the person I loved most, but I knew I needed time to process everything before sharing it with anyone. Michael complained about a difficult client and mentioned that his mother had called him at work to criticize something about our last family dinner. As he spoke, I found myself studying his face and wondering how he would react when he eventually learned the truth about my inheritance. Would he be excited, scared, guilty, or proud? Would it change how he saw me, or would it change how he saw himself in relation to his family's expectations? As Michael recounted his mother's latest complaints about me, I realized this was my first test of how the knowledge of my inheritance would affect my own behavior and reactions. In the past, hearing about Eleanor's criticism would have made me feel defensive, hurt, and eager to prove myself worthy of her approval. But now, knowing that I was actually wealthier and more socially connected than Eleanor could ever dream of being, I felt a strange sense of calm detachment. Her opinions about my worth were based on complete ignorance of who I really was and what I had inherited. I found myself almost amused by the irony that she was criticizing someone who could buy and sell her family's assets several times over. The question was whether I would eventually use this knowledge to humble her, or whether I would take the higher road that Grace's letter had encouraged me to follow. That night, as Michael slept peacefully beside me, I lay awake planning my next moves. I had to decide how long to keep the inheritance secret, how to test the people in my life, and most importantly, how to honor Grace's legacy of charitable giving while dealing with my complicated family relationships. I thought about all the times Eleanor had humiliated me, all the moments when Michael had failed to defend me adequately, and all the family members who had treated me like an unwelcome outsider. Now I had the power to change those dynamics completely, but I also had the responsibility to use that power wisely. Grace's letter had emphasized kindness and compassion over revenge, but I couldn't help fantasizing about the look on Eleanor's face when she discovered that the woman she had called worthless was actually the heir to one of Boston's most respected philanthropic fortunes. The next day, I returned to work at the hospital as if nothing had changed, but everything felt different. As I cared for patients and worked alongside my colleagues, I kept thinking about Grace's charitable foundation and how it supported medical research and patient care. I was literally working in the field that my grandmother had devoted her fortune to supporting, and none of my coworkers had any idea that I was now in a position to fund their department's wish lists several times over. The work felt more meaningful knowing that I could potentially expand these programs and help even more patients, but I also felt the weight of responsibility to make decisions that would honor Grace's memory and values rather than my own desire for revenge against Eleanor. During my lunch break, I received a call from Michael telling me that his mother had invited us to a family dinner that weekend. She specifically asked me to make sure you come, he said, which immediately made me suspicious since Eleanor usually tried to exclude me from family gatherings. She said she wants to make more of an effort to include you in family activities. I agreed to attend, realizing this would be the perfect opportunity to observe Eleanor's behavior when she had no idea about my changed circumstances. Would she continue her pattern of subtle cruelty and public humiliation, or had she genuinely decided to treat me better? Either way, I would now be watching her performance with the knowledge that I held more power in this relationship than she could possibly imagine. As I hung up the phone, I felt a mixture of anticipation and nervousness about the upcoming family dinner. This would be my first social interaction with the Wellington family since learning about my inheritance, and I knew it would be a crucial test of my own character as much as theirs. Would I be able to maintain my composure when Eleanor made her inevitable cutting remarks? Would I be tempted to hint at my newfound wealth and status? Or would I have the strength to continue playing the role of the struggling nurse while gathering information about everyone's true attitudes toward me? I realized that Grace had given me more than money. She had given me the power to see people's hearts clearly, and I was determined to use that gift wisely rather than vindicatively. Eleanor spent the entire afternoon preparing for what she had privately decided would be my final humiliation as a member of the Wellington family. She arranged the finest china, polished the silver until it gleamed, and invited 3 of Boston's most prominent families to witness what she planned to be my public disgrace. As she set each place card with deliberate precision, she rehearsed in her mind the cutting remarks she would make about my humble background, my inappropriate clothes, and my obvious unsuitability for their distinguished social circle. This wasn't just a family dinner. It was Eleanor's carefully orchestrated campaign to convince Michael once and for all that I was beneath their family standards and that he needed to seriously reconsider our marriage. Throughout the week leading up to the dinner, Eleanor made phone calls to her most influential friends, carefully planting seeds about the evening's entertainment. She told them they would finally get to meet Michael's interesting wife and witness firsthand why she was so concerned about her son's choice in marriage partners. She described me as a simple working girl who had somehow managed to trap her sophisticated son, and she hinted that the evening would provide ample evidence of my unsuitability for their elite social circle. Eleanor was essentially gathering an audience for what she intended to be my social execution, never imagining that she was actually arranging for her own public downfall in front of the very people whose approval she craved most. As I prepared for the dinner, I carefully chose my outfit with the knowledge that Eleanor would undoubtedly criticize whatever I wore. I selected a simple navy blue dress that I had bought on sale at a department store, modest, appropriate, but certainly not designer fashion by Eleanor's standards. As I looked at myself in our small bedroom mirror, I thought about how different this evening would be from Eleanor's perspective versus my own. She would see a struggling nurse wearing cheap clothes, trying desperately to fit into a world where she didn't belong. But I would be sitting at that table knowing I was worth more than everyone else in the room combined, watching Eleanor perform her cruelty for an audience that had no idea how wrong she was about everything. Michael was more nervous than usual as we prepared to leave for his mother's house, and I could tell he was dreading potential conflict between Eleanor and me. "Sarah, please just try to ignore anything Mother says that might upset you," he pleaded as he adjusted his tie for the 3rd time. "She's invited some important family friends tonight, and I really need this evening to go smoothly for everyone involved." His words stung because they revealed that he was more concerned about his mother's comfort and reputation than about protecting his wife from her verbal attacks. I realized this dinner would be a crucial test of whether Michael would finally find the courage to defend me when it really mattered, or whether he would continue to prioritize keeping peace with his mother over standing up for our marriage. When we arrived at the Wellington family mansion, I noticed immediately that this was no ordinary family dinner. Several expensive cars lined the circular driveway, and through the windows I could see elegantly dressed guests moving about the formal living areas. Eleanor had clearly turned this into a social event designed to showcase my inadequacies to as many influential people as possible. As we walked up the marble steps to the front door, I felt a strange sense of calm, knowing that I was about to enter a situation where I held all the real power, even though everyone else would assume I was the weakest person in the room. The irony was almost amusing. Eleanor had arranged for the perfect audience to witness her own humiliation. Eleanor greeted us at the door with her most artificial smile, warmly welcoming Michael while giving me barely a nod of acknowledgement. She was wearing an expensive designer gown and jewelry that probably cost more than I earned in a year, clearly dressed to emphasize the contrast between her wealth and my modest appearance. "Sarah, how? Nice to see you," she said with barely concealed disdain. "I do hope you'll feel comfortable this evening. We have some very distinguished guests joining us." Her tone made it clear that she expected me to feel intimidated and out of place, and she was already savoring the anticipated moments when I would embarrass myself in front of her carefully selected audience of Boston's social elite. As Eleanor led us into the formal living room, I was introduced to three couples who represented some of Boston's oldest and wealthiest families. Their reactions to meeting me were politely dismissive, the kind of social coldness reserved for people who were clearly beneath their station. I could see them taking in my simple dress, my department store shoes, and my obviously modest background, mentally categorizing me as someone who didn't belong in their exclusive circle. They asked polite but condescending questions about my little job at the hospital and made subtle comments about how refreshing it was to meet someone who lived such a simple lifestyle. I responded graciously while internally marveling at how quickly their attitudes would change if they knew the truth about my financial status. During cocktails before dinner, Eleanor began her performance in earnest, making pointed comments about the importance of breeding and family background in marriage. She spoke about how crucial it was for families to maintain their standards and not allow themselves to be diminished by inappropriate connections. She told stories about other wealthy families who had made the mistake of accepting unsuitable marriage partners and how those relationships had ended in disaster. Every comment was designed to make me feel ashamed of my background while positioning herself as the wise matriarch protecting her family's reputation. The other guests nodded along approvingly, clearly enjoying the entertainment of watching someone being subtly torn apart at a dinner party. As we moved to the dining room and took our seats, Eleanor's attacks became more direct and personal. She made comments about my quaint apartment, my limited education, and my uncertain family background. She questioned whether someone from my circumstances could really understand the responsibilities that came with being part of a prominent family. Each cutting remark was delivered with a sweet smile and in such a way that it would seem rude for me to object or defend myself. The other guests watched with fascination, clearly entertained by this display of social cruelty disguised as concern for family standards. But I sat there with growing confidence, knowing that every word Eleanor spoke was about to come back and devastate her in the most public way possible. As the main course was being served, Eleanor stood up and announced that she wanted to make a special toast. The room fell silent as she raised her wine glass and began what would become her most devastating mistake. "Tonight, I want to talk about the importance of knowing one's place in society and recognizing when someone simply doesn't belong in a family of distinction," she began, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room. "Some people are born to serve, and others are born to lead. It's crucial that we never forget these natural hierarchies, especially when making decisions about marriage and family connections." The other guests murmured their agreement, completely unaware that they were about to witness Eleanor's public humiliation at the hands of the woman she was so confidently destroying. Eleanor's voice grew stronger and more confident as she continued her devastating speech, clearly savoring what she believed was her moment of ultimate triumph. "Some women," she said, looking directly at me with undisguised contempt, "use manipulation and false pretenses to insert themselves into families where they simply don't belong. They pretend to be something they're not, hoping that love will blind their victims to their obvious inadequacies." The room was completely silent except for the sound of her voice, and I could feel every pair of eyes in the room focused on me as Eleanor delivered what she intended to be the killing blow to my reputation and my marriage. "Tonight, I want everyone to see exactly what kind of woman my son has unfortunately chosen to marry, and why our family standards must be protected from such unfortunate influences. As Eleanor's words washed over me like acid, I felt a strange sense of calm that I had never experienced before during one of her attacks. For 3 years, her criticism and cruelty had made me feel small, inadequate, and desperate to prove my worth to a woman who would never accept me. But now, sitting at her elegant table while she tried to destroy me in front of Boston's social elite, I felt nothing but pity for her ignorance and a growing sense of power. She had no idea that she was publicly humiliating someone who could buy her mansion several times over, someone whose grandmother had been more respected and beloved in Boston society than Eleanor could ever dream of being. Every cruel word she spoke was about to boomerang back and destroy her own reputation in the most spectacular way possible. I glanced at Michael and saw the conflict written across his face as his mother publicly eviscerated his wife in front of their most important social connections. Part of him looked mortified by his mother's cruelty, but another part seemed paralyzed by his lifelong habit of avoiding confrontation with Eleanor. The other guests were beginning to shift uncomfortably in their seats, clearly sensing that this dinner party had crossed the line from entertainment into something darker and more vicious. Some of the women were exchanging glances that suggested they found Eleanor's behavior excessive, even by the standards of their competitive social circle. But no one spoke up to defend me, and Michael remained frozen in his chair, once again failing to protect his wife when she needed him most. Eleanor was now building to the crescendo of her performance, her voice rising with righteous indignation as she delivered what she believed would be her final victory over me. A woman who contributes nothing to our family's legacy, who brings no resources, no connections, no value beyond her ability to manipulate a good man's heart. Such a person has no place at our table or in our family. The room was electric with tension as Eleanor's guests waited to see how I would respond to this public destruction of my character and marriage. But instead of dissolving into tears or fleeing in humiliation, as Eleanor clearly expected, I calmly reached for my purse and pulled out the folder of documents that Mr. Harrison had given me just days earlier. The time had come for Eleanor to learn exactly who she had been tormenting for the past 3 years. I stood up slowly, and the room fell into complete silence as everyone waited to see how the woman who had just been publicly humiliated would respond. Eleanor looked supremely satisfied, clearly expecting me to either break down in tears or storm out in defeat, either of which would confirm everything she had just said about my character and suitability for their family. Instead, I placed the inheritance documents on the table in front of me and spoke in a calm, clear voice that carried to every corner of the room. Eleanor, I think it's time you learned something about the woman you've been calling worthless for the past 3 years. I think everyone here deserves to know the truth about my family background and my actual contribution to Boston society. The look of confusion that crossed Eleanor's face was the first crack in her confident facade. I picked up the first document and held it where everyone could see the official letterhead of Harrison and Associates, one of Boston's most prestigious law firms. Last week, I discovered that I am the sole heir to the estate of Grace Elizabeth Wellington, who passed away 3 months ago, I announced clearly. The effect was immediate and electric. Several guests gasped audibly. Eleanor's face went completely white, and even Michael looked shocked at this news he was hearing for the first time. Grace Wellington left me her entire fortune, including $15 million in cash and investments, 3 properties, and control of her charitable foundation that has donated millions to Boston's hospitals, schools, and social services over the past 4 decades. The silence in the room was deafening as everyone processed the magnitude of what I had just revealed. Eleanor's hands began to tremble as the full impact of my revelation hit her. Grace Wellington had been a legend in Boston society, a woman whose philanthropic work had earned her respect from everyone who mattered in their social circle. Eleanor herself had attended charity events hosted by Grace and had always spoken of her with reverence and admiration. The idea that the woman she had spent 3 years calling worthless and inferior was actually Grace Wellington's granddaughter and heir was so shocking that she literally had to grip the table to keep from falling. That's impossible," she whispered, but her voice carried no conviction. She could see the legal documents in my hands, and she knew that Harrison and Associates would never be involved in anything fraudulent or questionable. I pulled out the photograph of Grace that Mr. Harrison had shown me and passed it around the table, watching as each guest recognized the woman who had been a pillar of Boston society for decades. Grace was my biological grandmother, I explained. My mother was her daughter Rebecca, who eloped with my father when she was 17 after a family disagreement. Grace spent 30 years searching for us, and she finally found me just months before her death. She left me everything because she wanted to ensure that her family legacy of service and philanthropy would continue. The guests were staring at the photograph in wonder, clearly remembering Grace's legendary charity galas, her hospital donations, and her quiet but significant influence on Boston's cultural and social institutions. They were beginning to realize that they had just witnessed someone attack the heir to one of Boston's most respected fortunes. I turned to face Eleanor directly, and for the first time in 3 years, she was the one who looked small and powerless. Eleanor, you've spent countless hours telling people that I contribute nothing to your family's legacy and that I have no value beyond manipulating your son's emotions. You've criticized my modest apartment, my simple clothes, and my working-class background. You've made it clear that you believe I'm beneath your family's standards and unworthy of respect. My voice remained calm and steady, but every word carried the weight of 3 years of accumulated pain and humiliation. But the truth is that I am now worth more than your entire family's net worth combined, and I carry the name and legacy of a woman who was more respected in Boston society than you could ever hope to be. The color drained completely from Eleanor's face as she realized that her carefully constructed world of social superiority had just collapsed around her. The transformation in the room was immediate and complete. The guests who had been enjoying Eleanor's cruel entertainment just minutes earlier were now whispering among themselves about the incredible revelation they had just witnessed. They were looking at me with new respect and interest, while Eleanor appeared to be shrinking before their eyes. She tried to speak several times, but no words came out as she struggled to process the magnitude of her mistake. She had just publicly humiliated the granddaughter of Grace Wellington in front of some of Boston's most influential families, people who had undoubtedly spread this story throughout their social circle within hours. Her reputation as a wise family matriarch protecting her son from an unsuitable marriage had been destroyed in an instant, replaced by the image of a cruel woman who had tormented someone far more worthy than herself for years without realizing her terrible error. I held up the official inheritance documents from Harrison and Associates, making sure everyone in the room could see the impressive legal letterhead and Grace Wellington's name prominently featured throughout the paperwork. These documents prove that I am the sole beneficiary of Grace Elizabeth Wellington's estate, valued at over $15 million. I announced clearly, my voice carrying to every corner of the now silent dining room. The guests were hanging on every word, their earlier dismissive attitudes completely transformed as they realized they were witnessing one of the most dramatic social reversals in Boston society's recent history. Eleanor's face had gone from white to gray, and she was gripping the edge of the table so tightly that her knuckles were completely colorless as the magnitude of her 3-year campaign of cruelty began to sink in. I pulled out Grace's personal letter and read excerpts aloud to the mesmerized audience. My grandmother wrote, "Sarah, you are a nurse, which tells me you have inherited our family's compassion and desire to care for others. I have spent 30 years searching for you, my precious granddaughter, and I pray that this inheritance will allow you to continue our family's tradition of service to those in need." Several of the female guests had tears in their eyes as they listened to Grace's loving words, remembering the legendary philanthropist's kindness and generosity. They were beginning to understand that they had just witnessed someone viciously attack a woman whose family legacy of charitable giving had touched their own lives and the lives of countless others throughout Boston. The contrast between Grace's loving acceptance and Eleanor's years of cruelty was becoming painfully obvious to everyone present. Eleanor finally found her voice, but it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Grace Wellington, was your grandmother?" she asked, as if saying the words aloud might somehow make them less true. But that's impossible. She was one of the most respected women in Boston. She built hospitals, funded scholarships, supported every major charitable cause in the city. Her voice was shaking as she spoke, and I could see her mind frantically trying to reconcile the woman she had tormented for 3 years with the granddaughter of someone she had always held in the highest regard. The other guests were nodding in agreement about Grace's reputation, which only made Eleanor's position more untenable. She was realizing that she had spent years attacking someone whose family had contributed more to Boston society than her own family ever had. Grace spent decades looking for her lost family. I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. She never stopped believing that love and compassion were more important than social status or inherited wealth. She used her fortune to build the children's wing at Boston General Hospital, where I work as a nurse, not knowing that her own granddaughter was caring for patients in the very building she had funded. The irony was not lost on anyone in the room. I had been working at a hospital funded by my own grandmother's charity, while Eleanor criticized me for being beneath their family standards. Several guests were shaking their heads in amazement at the cosmic justice of the situation. Grace believed that true worth came from service to others, not from putting people down or making them feel inferior because of their circumstances. The atmosphere in the room had completely transformed as the dinner guests began to fully grasp what they had just witnessed. These were people who had known and respected Grace Wellington, who had attended her charity events and benefited from her philanthropic work. They were now looking at Eleanor with barely concealed disapproval, realizing that she had spent years tormenting the heir to one of Boston's most beloved legacies. The woman who had seemed so sophisticated and wise just minutes earlier now appeared petty, cruel, and embarrassingly ignorant. Several guests were whispering among themselves, and I could see them mentally reviewing every cutting remark Eleanor had made about my character and background, now understanding how completely wrong she had been about everything. Michael sat in stunned silence, his face a mixture of shock, confusion, and dawning guilt as he processed the revelation that his wife was not only wealthy beyond imagination, but also carried one of Boston's most respected family names. I could see him replaying every family gathering where he had failed to adequately defend me, every time he had asked me to just ignore his mother's cruelty, every moment when he had chosen keeping peace with Eleanor over protecting his wife. The knowledge that I had endured 3 years of abuse, while secretly being worth more than his entire family, was clearly devastating to him. He was beginning to understand that his weak responses to his mother's attacks had not just hurt me personally. They had allowed someone to torment the granddaughter of a woman his family had always claimed to respect and admire. I looked around the room at each face, seeing the complete reversal in their attitudes toward me and Eleanor. My grandmother Grace believed that people should be judged by their actions and character, not by their bank accounts or family connections, I said clearly. She would be heartbroken to know that someone was using social status as a weapon to hurt others, especially in her own family name. The guests were nodding in agreement, remembering Grace's reputation for kindness and inclusivity despite her enormous wealth and influence. Grace taught through her example that true class comes from treating everyone with dignity and respect, regardless of their circumstances. She proved that real strength comes from lifting others up, not from tearing them down. My words hung in the air like a moral judgment that everyone in the room could feel and understand. Eleanor's composed facade finally cracked completely as tears began to form in her eyes. The weight of her 3-year campaign of cruelty was crushing down on her as she realized that every cutting remark, every public humiliation, every attempt to make me feel worthless had been directed at someone who was not only wealthier than her family, but also carried the legacy of a woman she had always admired. I didn't know, she whispered, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. Her ignorance was not an excuse for the deliberate cruelty she had shown me, and everyone in the room understood that. She had revealed her own character through her treatment of someone she perceived as powerless, and now that character was being judged by people whose opinions she valued most. For 3 years, Eleanor, you've made me feel like I wasn't good enough for this family, I said, my voice steady but filled with the pain of accumulated years of abuse. You've criticized everything about me, my clothes, my job, my background, my character. You've told people I was a gold digger who trapped your son, when the truth is that I married Michael despite his family's wealth, not because of it. I've worked double shifts at a hospital, lived in a tiny apartment, and tried desperately to prove my worth to a woman who had already decided I was worthless. The guests were listening with rapt attention, finally understanding the full scope of Eleanor's cruelty and the incredible grace I had shown in enduring it without revealing my true circumstances. Some of the women looked genuinely moved by my story, perhaps remembering times when they had been judged unfairly themselves. The silence that followed my words was profound and heavy with the weight of truth. Eleanor sat completely motionless, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks as she absorbed the full magnitude of her mistake. The woman she had spent years calling worthless was actually the heir to a fortune and legacy that dwarfed her own family's achievements. The guests were already beginning to whisper among themselves about this incredible story that would undoubtedly become legendary in Boston social circles within days. Eleanor's reputation as a wise family matriarch was destroyed forever, replaced by the image of a cruel woman who had systematically tormented someone far more worthy than herself. The expression on her face was indeed priceless, a mixture of horror, shame, and devastation that would be burned into my memory forever as the moment when justice finally prevailed over years of undeserved cruelty. In the profound silence that followed my revelation, I slowly sat back down at the table, feeling a sense of completion rather than triumph. The room remained frozen in the aftermath of Eleanor's public humiliation, with guests stealing glances between her devastated face and my calm composure. For 3 years, I had dreamed of this moment when Eleanor would finally understand who she had been tormenting, but now that it had arrived, I felt more sadness than satisfaction. Grace's letter had taught me that revenge was far less important than justice, and justice had been served not through my actions, but through the simple revelation of truth. Eleanor's cruelty had destroyed itself through its own ignorance, and I realized that this moment was not really about my victory. It was about the choice I would make next that would define my character and honor my grandmother's legacy. I looked around the table at the faces of Boston's social elite, people who would spread this story throughout their circles within hours, and made a decision that would have made Grace proud. I want everyone here to understand something important, I said clearly, my voice carrying the authority that came not just from wealth but from moral certainty. I didn't reveal my inheritance tonight to humiliate Eleanor or to seek revenge for the years of pain she caused me. I revealed it because I believe that truth matters more than social pretense, and because I think we all need to examine how we treat people based on our assumptions about their worth. The guests were hanging on every word, clearly recognizing that they were witnessing not just a dramatic social reversal, but a moral lesson that challenged their own attitudes and behaviors. My grandmother Grace believed that wealth was meaningless unless it was used to help others. I continued, feeling Grace's spirit guiding my words. I plan to expand her charitable foundation and continue her work of supporting hospitals, funding education, and helping families in need. The Children's Wing at Boston General, where I work, will receive additional funding for equipment and research. We'll establish new scholarship programs for nursing students who want to serve underprivileged communities. And we'll create a program to help young mothers who are struggling to support their families, just as my own mother struggled after leaving Grace's family. The guests were nodding with approval, clearly impressed by my plans to honor Grace's philanthropic legacy. Even in her devastated state, I could see Eleanor absorbing the fact that I intended to use my inheritance for noble purposes rather than personal indulgence. Eleanor finally found her voice, though it was thick with tears and shame. "Sarah," she whispered, her earlier confidence completely shattered. I don't know what to say. I had no idea about your family connection to Grace. If I had known, she trailed off, perhaps realizing that her words revealed the shallowness of her character, that she would have treated me differently only if she had known about my wealth and social connections. The other guests were watching this exchange with fascination, witnessing what might be the first genuine moment of vulnerability they had ever seen from Eleanor Wellington. But I could see in her eyes that she was beginning to understand that her cruelty hadn't been wrong just because of my secret inheritance. It had been wrong because it was cruelty, period. Eleanor, I said gently, surprising everyone in the room, including myself, with the compassion in my voice. The problem wasn't that you didn't know about my inheritance. The problem was that you thought it was acceptable to treat anyone the way you treated me, regardless of their background or circumstances. My words carried no anger or bitterness, just the sad truth that needed to be spoken. Grace taught through her life that every person deserves dignity and respect, whether they're a hospital janitor or a wealthy socialite. My worth as a human being was never dependent on my bank account, just as your worth isn't dependent on yours. The guests were clearly moved by my response, recognizing that I was offering Eleanor a path toward redemption rather than grinding her defeat deeper into the ground. Michael finally broke his shocked silence, his voice choked with emotion as he addressed his mother. "Mom, Sarah's right. What you've done to her over these 3 years has been inexcusable, and I should have stopped it long ago instead of asking her to just ignore your behavior." His words came too late to undo the damage, but I could hear genuine remorse and newfound resolve in his voice. "I've been a coward, afraid to stand up to you, because I didn't want family conflict, but my first loyalty should have been to my wife, not to keeping peace with someone who was systematically trying to destroy her." The guests were witnessing not just Eleanor's downfall, but Michael's moment of moral clarity, though it had taken this dramatic revelation to give him the courage he should have shown years earlier. Eleanor's composure collapsed entirely as the full weight of her 3-year campaign of cruelty crashed down on her. "I've been so wrong," she sobbed, her voice barely recognizable from the confident, cutting tone she had used just minutes earlier. "I convinced myself that I was protecting my family, but I was really just being cruel to someone who never deserved it. Grace Wellington's granddaughter. God help me, what have I done?" Her breakdown was complete and genuine, revealing that beneath her social pretensions was someone capable of recognizing her own moral failures. The guests were uncomfortable witnessing such raw emotion from someone they had always seen as impeccably controlled, but they could see that Eleanor's remorse was real rather than performed. Looking at Eleanor's broken figure, I felt the compassion that Grace had written about in her letter overwhelming my desire for continued justice. "Eleanor, I forgive you," I said simply, and the words seemed to echo through the silent room like a benediction. "I forgive you not because you've learned about my inheritance, but because forgiveness is what Grace would have wanted, and because holding on to anger would dishonor her memory." Several of the female guests were now openly crying, moved by this display of grace in the face of years of systematic cruelty. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean that our relationship can simply return to what it was before. Moving forward, I expect to be treated with the same respect you would show any member of this family, not because of my wealth, but because I'm Michael's wife and a human being worthy of basic dignity. Eleanor nodded vigorously through her tears, clearly understanding that she was being offered something precious and undeserved. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I understand. And I promise, I swear to you that I will spend the rest of my life making up for what I've done. Not because of your inheritance, but because you're right. You deserved respect and kindness from the very beginning, and I failed you completely." Michael reached over and squeezed my hand, his eyes filled with gratitude and love as he witnessed his wife's incredible grace in the face of years of abuse. The other guests were clearly moved by this display of forgiveness and redemption, recognizing that they had witnessed something profound about the nature of true character and moral strength. As I sit here now, reflecting on that life-changing evening, I want you to know that learning about my inheritance taught me something more valuable than money could ever provide. It taught me that my worth was never determined by Eleanor's opinion of me, or by anyone else's judgment for that matter. Whether I had $15 or $15 million, I deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. Grace's legacy wasn't really about the money she left me. It was about the lesson that true strength comes from lifting others up rather than tearing them down, and that forgiveness is often the most powerful response to cruelty. Where are you watching this story from today? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to stand up to someone who underestimated you? Remember to like this video if it touched your heart, and subscribe for more incredible true stories about the power of love, forgiveness, and never giving up on your own worth. C00P010. Woman, 28, shoulder-length blonde hair, blue eyes, in worn department store dress and simple appearance, holding million-dollar inheritance papers with serene confidence. Woman, 58, silver gray hair and elegant updo, cold green eyes, dripping in diamonds and designer couture with devastated expression as her world crumbles. Opulent ballroom setting with marble columns and gold fixtures. Other guests in evening gowns and tuxedos witnessing the poor nurse humbling the wealthy socialite. Stark lighting contrasting humble versus extravagant appearances while revealing the complete reversal of true power and worth. Maximum social class contrast composition. YouTube thumbnail style.